Was there any similar sort of entity or story group, so to speak, in the expanded universe?
And they also sent me a thing called the Holocron, which was a CD-ROM that had everything Star Wars on it.
What would you say was the biggest change to Yoda and also to the Jedi?
Can I ask you? Because my guess is you've thought about it more than I have.
A great deal. Hey guys, welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. Today, I'm ecstatic to meet a very special guest, Mr. Sean Stewart. He's a winner of Prime and Time Emmy, World Fantasy and Aurora Awards. He's a writer for fantasy science fiction books, game content, and something we call ARG, Alternative Reality Gaming. We're going to talk about his career at LucasFilm. We're going to obviously talk the big elephant in the room, the Yoda Dark Rendezvous, which many fans, including myself, enjoyed, and more. Mr. Sean, I'm so delighted to have you here. Please tell us, how's your day going so far? What's the latest in the career of professional LucasFilm author?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to chat. It's always fun just to talk to people who like books and stories. What is the latest thing happening I'm working on another novel, which is a thing I haven't done in 15 years or so. And I just got back from helping make a 4-day-long immersive Mayan Hamlet theater experience in the Yucatan in Mexico.
Interesting. So, can you mention briefly, because not many of us may be exactly familiar, and not to confuse it with virtual reality video gaming, what is alternative reality gaming in general?
So, alternate reality games is first when me and some friends of mine made the first one, but it wasn't called that. It was just called this weird thing that we made. Mm-hmm. We had been given this project to work to create the world of the Steven Spielberg film AI online and to tell a story online. So it was a story where you might stumble across the name of a character in a weird way. Like in the movie poster, there was a credit for sentient machine therapist. Mm-hmm. And if you happen to look up sentient machine therapist, you would find a webpage for one. And it said that she was working at the New York campus of Bangalore World University, and the year was 2142. And you could follow the links and find 70 other departments at Bangalore World University. And out from there onto a sort of proliferation of more than 1,000 websites telling the story of this world of 2142. And over time, you would find new websites, or you would call characters on the phone, or they would call you, or they would send fax machines, or there would be clues in your local newspaper, or hidden in the world around you, or real live meetups. One way or another, the story rolled on through all these different channels. Mm-hmm. If I can jump up one level, the idea was, instead of thinking of a story being a book or a video game or a movie, instead imagine there's a story and it's coming to you, Ben. Right. It's coming to you on your browser, in your email, over your phone. Every way we can possibly think to reach you, you are the movie screen that the story is being projected on. Mm-hmm. Your life becomes the thing we tell the story across.
The best example I can think of for those of us who were there, let you see like the early stages of America Online, it was very, very popular to market popular blockbuster movies with their own dedicated website. And I remember when Matrix website launched, we were so enthralled with its storytelling in the world. And then you go home and you see this weird scrolling green text, and then you type in your name and then follow the white rabbit over here. So it's that sort of interactive story that sort of pulls you into that world, and the movie's story, pours itself out into reality, and you start interacting. Obviously, you know it's fake, but it was so enjoyable and fun because, like you said, it addresses you. Hold on, it's me? I am Neo? I'm going to follow the white rabbit. It was so exciting and interesting. But something that I mentioned earlier, computer games in general, video games or, your desktop tower. Have you played any of the augmented reality games, maybe like with an Oculus headset or in any other shape or form?
I've done a little bit of that stuff. I worked for a few years at a place called Magic Leap, which was building augmented reality
Hmm.
stuff. Um, and then the pandemic happened and that stopped, as is so often the case.
Yeah.
So I've done some of that. There are some beautiful experiences out there. Um, it's a tricky way to do traditional storytelling because
In a way, you have
when
to
I
like
write stories,
anticipate and respond to a player's every move, right? If I may
right,
add, right?
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. What you have to do with VR and AR is understand that it's really not about you. Like the worst VR you'll ever see is made by someone who went to film school,
Mm.
because film school teaches you how to control the exactly what someone is looking at every second and create a story out of that.
Hmm.
And film school people often come to VR thinking it's like a way to make my movie more awesome. But in fact, in VR and AR, what the audience can do is look somewhere else. And that changes entirely the dynamic of how you relate to those things.
Hmm.
So if I can take a old school gaming metaphor, I don't know if you ever played the game Myst.
Of course.
Um, okay, so the idea of Myst loosely is you go explore around the world, and every now and then you find another page in the Myst book, and gradually you fill in the Myst book and you read the story that way, but it comes out of your exploration.
Hmm.
That's the fundamental dynamic behind alternate reality games. And that's the fundamental dynamic. Probably it's going to be a core engine of VR or AR storytelling, because it says the audience wants to explore. Everything comes after that rather than you saying, sit down, be quiet, watch my movie.
Yeah, in a way, if cinema meant to tell you a linear story from the beginning to the end, obviously there were some avant-garde films which kind of like went against this formula, but in general terms, then video games brought the player to the forefront where you're now in control of the story. And due to technological advancements with augmented reality, now it changed the whole paradigm shift of storytelling, as you mentioned. So now it's all open to you. You want to be completely in control. You want to feel like the world is tangible and you're pushing it sort of with your mind and with your ideas. Like, for example, some of the games that I played are Half-Life, the augmented reality version of the game, or the
Oh, really?
Darth Vader Immortal, or there's a popular PC title called Asgard's Wrath, which is a fantasy game set in this open world, and you want to like experiment. Hold on a second, let me grab a sword. Can I just like push this barrel? It's so interesting. It turns your inner child outwardly, and you want to experiment and have a good time in it.
That's really interesting. I'm so interested you've done that, and we can talk sometime later. I'd love to hear your thoughts
Mm-hmm.
on some of those individual titles. So one of the things that I absolutely wasn't going to talk about, but now I will. Um, I'm also working on uh, I have a company that uses generative AI for storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I look around and someone says, I used Gen AI to write a movie script, or I used Gen AI to write a book, I think, dude, you just are doing it wrong. You are a film guy making VR. The point of Gen AI is not that it's going to make me a better writer, because if it did, then I should get another job. Um, but what it can do is let you, the audience, say, but what if instead of doing what this story expects me to do, I want to go somewhere else? What if there's a sword lying on the ground when the bad guy shows up, but I want to say, dude, it's a rap battle. Gen AI will let you do that, but it's not that it's going to write better prose than me or even set up a better story situation than I can. But what it does do is let you, the user, have that same experience of pushing back, exploration. How can I touch this world and see how it responds to me?
Yeah.
So exactly what you're saying about AR and VR is exactly what I'm messing around with
Mm-hmm.
the generative AI. And if you're interested sometime after this is over, I'll show you a
Absolutely.
demo.
I'll be
You can
willing.
let you know.
I'm always keeping in the back of my mind, Ben, Star Wars, Star Wars. But, I can't have a conversation with an established author and just talk about Star Wars. I think expanded universe fans will appreciate the span of your career, the things that kind of excite you today and where your career may go in the future. And yet they will follow, because for many of us, Star Wars books were a trampoline to exploring your personal adventures. Like Tim Zahn, so many fans bring his name up as an author in Star Wars, and then they were introduced to his other books. It was an interesting start. But now turning a page to Star Wars,
Yeah.
are you up to date with any of the modern projects? Like, we have now the streaming services, and they put all of their films there, all the TV shows. Are there any of the recent movies past the George Lucas that you enjoyed, or maybe shows? What spoke to you the most?
I don't know if this is a common or a very eccentric opinion. I liked Rogue One a whole lot. I probably walked out of the theater feeling more satisfied after that film than any Star Wars film since arguably Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, wow.
Uh, and I loved Andor. I thought it was so beautifully written. Again, there are always, because this is my job, there are always things, oh, well, yeah, you could have tightened up the middle of the second act in episode 4. But generally speaking, I thought Andor was a just tremendous accomplishment that made the stakes of that world and the stakes of the rebellion really, really clear. And it was also just a pleasure how beautifully the story and the characters sort of moved together going forward. So that for me was a highlight. I also had a lot of fun with particularly the first couple of seasons of Mandalorian. But Andor is my favorite of the modern projects, I think.
Yeah, if I may add also, I'm a huge fan. I remember coming out of the theaters of Rogue One, and I bought the tickets for my younger brother, his girlfriend, a bunch of our friends, and they were all came out. I mean, our response was unanimous. It was like, oh my God, what did I just see? And with Andor, a lot of fans seem to speak of it in regards to Star Wars has matured now. It's more serious toned. And other fans, well, hold on a second. Star Wars is always this merry adventure and escapism. It's not up our alley. What do you mean more serious toned? For me personally, it meant during the prequel era, and specifically with the Disney era, everything is very linear in terms of what you see is what you get. Andor added subtext. You have a character who speaks on the screen, and then there's added layer, added very deliberate story going on that is conveyed via emotion or a musical piece or a background element that tells you what the heck is going on, and it trusts the audience to figure out what is happening. That was my take on it. I was a huge fan of it.
Yeah, 100%. The guy who wrote it was also the writer of the movie Michael Clayton. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it, and you'll immediately see, oh yeah, I get it, that guy.
Yeah, I've seen Tony Gilroy, obviously, Jason Bourne series, but this one I haven't checked out. Maybe I'll put a bookmark there and take a look at it. But Mr. Sean, the expanded universe as we knew it pretty much ended in 2014 when Lucasfilm decided to rebrand it and say, look, guys, this part of the story, this rich 40-year project is now here. We're going to call it Legends. We're not going to touch it as it was intended. We're going to start anew and call it the new Star Wars canon. Now, hopefully this is not too tricky of a question, but if it was up to you, would you have continued the expanded universe? And do you feel like your personal experience with it had potential to tell more interesting stories?
That's such an interesting question. I'll tell you, rather than watch me think, which, is about how interesting interviews with writers often are.
Yeah.
Just to say things out loud. I understand both sides of that. I understand there's a lot built, and everything built allows you to, what happened to that character? How do we pick up this theme? And I also understand that sometimes you want to go back and just start fresh and take a new line. You know, they memorably, I mean, I think we have J.J. Abrams to blame for this in two fandoms, right?
Right.
His experience saying, all previous Star Trek doesn't count. It was sort of what he brought to the more recent Star Wars films. And I kind of understand where he was going, and it allowed him to do this extremely bold cinematic thing in Star Trek where like Vulcan disappears. Um, I guess what I would say, stepping back a little bit, is whether you call it canon or not, the work that has juice from that era will continue to have juice. And the work that is forgettable will be forgotten. And I think ultimately how Lucasfilm slash Disney slash Del Rey says this thing is canon, that isn't, that's not really, art is always survival of the fittest. And the things, whether they call them canon or not, that move and inspire people are the things that will last.
And if I may bring it into focus in regards to the book we're talking about today, Yoda Dark Rendezvous, there's an animated show that came out, an anthology rather, called Tales of the Jedi. I was so hopeful it would draw upon the original comics written by the late Tom Veitch and later on continued by, oh my God, blanking on the name, my favorite author. Kevin J. Anderson. Oh my God, I apologize. I'm just a little bit nervous. And you know that, but they decided to go a different route. And there is a bit of an antagonism going on between the original fans saying, well, you know, we had 40 years of build story. Where are you going with this? Why are you starting from scratch? But I also understood the impulse to say, give us a new page to turn. Let us start something different and put also creative forces into it, see what we can come up with. And here comes the show, which I think Disney right now absolutely thrives and rock and rolls in regards to animated shows. And in this story, the anthology, we see a younger version of Count Dooku interacting with Yoda. I don't know if you've seen it or not. There's a small scene taking place on Coruscant. And I could have sworn the exchange between the two, I'm like, oh my God, this is from the book. I was ecstatic. And then I started exchanging ideas with other fans that I talked to on YouTube channel, on the X, different social platforms. And like, Ben, you're absolutely right. Oh my God. The authors of that particular episode, they have read Sean Stewart's novel. They know what they're talking about. And this sort of foreshadows something that some people call, it's obsolete now. You know, it's old, it's legends. I couldn't believe it. You see the obvious connection there. I was so excited.
Oh, that's fun. Well, let me know where that occurs. I'd be interested to check it out.
Sure, absolutely. After we go off the air, I'll point out the episode to you. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But guys, the book, Yoda, Dark Rendezvous, it came out in November of 2004. It was part of the Clone Wars era multimedia project. Because when George Lucas launched with Phantom Menace in 1999, it wasn't just a movie. It was a whole renaissance of Star Wars storytelling. They kicked off with a whole bunch of Dark Horse comic books. We started later getting, after episode 1, including episode 1, I remember the PlayStation 1 video game and so forth. So it was a multimedia project that they were telling. What was it like being approached by Lucasfilm in the first place?
So this is I have to throw up a caveat here, which is, as I mentioned to you offline,
right,
that there was a multimedia project was something I had no idea about until about 8 months ago. So I was unaware of the depth and breadth of what was happening, or even the fact that each of the things that were coming out in real time. So my book that takes place 6 months before Order 66 was released 6 months before the movie came out.
Revenge of the Sith, right?
But what actually happened, and this may be very anticlimactic from your point of view, Del Rey owed a book. They owed a book about Yoda. And they had been unable to think, what on earth that book would possibly be, or who in the world would possibly write it. So they were quite a bit overdue.
Right.
And so one day, two of the editors at Del Rey, this is as told to me, obviously. Two editors for Del Rey said, listen, we're going to go to lunch and we're not going to come back from lunch until we have a plan of attack on who is going to write this Star Wars book about Yoda. And so they stared at each other over lunch and possibly into cocktails. And then, as told to me, they looked up one another and at the same moment said, Sean. Meanwhile, I have to ask myself, how do you become the answer to that question? What is it about the work that I had produced from, I don't know, 92 to 2003 that made them think, Yoda guy. But they reached out and they said, listen, do you have an idea? Would you be interested at all? And I said yes for a couple of reasons. One, it's good to be working, but I was a Star Wars kid, as I mentioned, off the air. I was 11 or 12 when the movie came out. I was the perfect age, lightsabers, Han Solo, Jedi. I
Beautiful
was
princess, yeah.
100% all in. I was that kid who got a piece of PVC tubing and taped it to a flashlight with black electrical tape to make a lightsaber, because the subsequent tech is much better, but we didn't have that.
Right.
So, and then the other thing was, and perhaps this is imprudent of me, but I felt like the character of Yoda in Empires was pretty great and had been allowed to somehow drift into becoming kind of just random dude saying kind of Hallmark card versions of wisdom in the background of some of those middle movies. So I thought there was an opportunity to make Yoda great again, and try to say this was a tremendous character. Let's try to honor what it was that made him strange and powerful and weird and wise, rather than kind of bland, because that is a character that should never be bland.
We will definitely touch upon Yoda in that specific frame for sure, because you're sort of reading my mind. I don't know if you have special Jedi powers or not, but it's exactly, to me, the way that the Jedi were portrayed, including Yoda and what they turned into, the prequels, which many fans say that's exactly what George Lucas was going for, to show you that contrast, where they were, and then we see them completely destroyed in the original trilogy. To me, it was such a stark difference, including Yoda, from what I remember as a kid, that little world that I built with my imagination, right? That it's an infinite question, what is Yoda's role in it? And as I said, we will touch a little bit more upon that later. But there's another interesting thing I wanted to pick up with you in regards to that first hiring process and getting into writing your first Star Wars novel. The story team came much later. They formed in 2013, obviously, under new Disney direction. But early authors that I got the chance to interview, like Kenneth Flint, who had only a short story published in one of the Star Wars anthologies, but he also had an unpublished book, Heart of the Jedi, which fans have embraced because it was published through his own means and it's free and it's available to everyone. Anyway, the point that some of these authors were making, that they had to develop a lot of their concepts for the early Bantam era. We're talking about mid to late 90s to early 2000s. They were kind of excavating what source of information were available. And they were telling me there wasn't much lore to draw upon. That aside from the West End Games tabletop games, they pretty much had to work from scratch. They could ask, what is that specific tech called, or what is the ship's name, or what is that other planet that has been not used much before that we could put it on a book. But aside from that, not much to go on. So my question is, was there any similar sort of entity or story group, so to speak, in the expanded universe? And did you have any clear idea of the novel that they wanted you to write?
Two quite distinct questions. So by the time we started talking, I was going to have to write the book in about 4 months,
Mm.
um, which is very fast for me. Normally, a book takes me a year. And even given that it's easier when the world sort of exists, it's still pretty quick. So um, I got, I know some people have had quite a back and forth. And my experience was great. I said, hey, what do you think of this idea? And they said, sounds great. Um, what does it need to do? And they said, well, it's got to take place about 6 months before Order 66. It's got to have Yoda in it. If you could mention at some point Anakin and Obi-Wan who are doing something, and ideally we'd like to do something more with this character called Count Dooku.
Mm.
And so those were really my only marching orders. And I said, okay, so I kind of, if I didn't have free reign to make up a whole bunch of stuff about who Count Dooku was, no one ever told me otherwise. Um, and the story group and the continuity group at this point was actually a dude named Leland Chi, who's a name I'm sure you've heard before. Um, and so the deal I struck with Star Wars was I can write this book, and I think I have an idea that I think will work. But what I do not have time to do is become a deep lore master. So I need an email I can write so that I can say, hey, I need a blue alien. What are my choices, please? And someone will write me back and tell me. So the two things they gave me were the email of Leland Chi, who served as that one guy who knows all of the things. And they also sent me a thing called the Holocron, which was
Mhm.
a CD-ROM that had everything Star Wars on it. And which I realized at one point, I was like trying to look something up, and then I paused for a moment and thought, this is probably worth more than my car. Like, if my house burned down, this would probably be worth more on eBay than anything else I own.
How come?
Um, just because it had all the Star Wars stuff on it from an official Star Wars source.
Mhm.
Um, now I'm sure they would never burn a drive with all that stuff. It would all be in the cloud and it would be secured. To read the script for the film, I had to drive to the ranch
Mhm.
and then sign into the building, and then I couldn't take a camera or anything, any kind of recording device with me. They put me into a single room. You couldn't take the script out of the room, and every page of the script was printed on um, material with metal threads through it, like money, like British currency, to make it hard to photocopy. So
Wow.
a couple of years later, uh, I would get invited, long, strange story. I would get invited to talk to the CIA about alternate reality games. And I never stopped musing over the fact that the security in the building I went to at the CIA was considerably less intense than the security at Lucasfilm.
Wow, this is so awesome. This is really interesting because, the name that you bring up, I was vaguely aware of the holocron because at early stages of the internet, the early 2000s when the prequels were coming out, we didn't have a lot of sources. Mostly we relied on fan sites like the Forced Net and other ones, but we were vaguely aware of something like a holocron, a sort of like Excel sheet of every known piece of information put in there, but also Pablo Hidalgo's name was being thrown out there during the later years that he was involved with writing these guidebooks and reading manuals and in which order to read. So he kind of became a maestro from his personal angle. So I was interested if you crossed paths with him or if his name was ever mentioned before.
I honestly just can't remember well enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know Leland was the guy that I had the email for, but also, I will say the first alternate reality game was 2001. And one of the things I had learned from that is the fans know more than you do. Even if you're making the thing, the fans still know more than you do. So whatever fan resources existed in 2004, I was probably also checking with them, because that I've gotten very fast at going through all the forerunners of it's now Reddit, it was Penny Arcade, it was Yahoo Groups, it was all these places where the fan communities have met at one point or another, have always been pretty rich sources. And the fans know stuff that you don't. So
Yeah, and it's so humbling of you to say that you are this person who was entrusted to writing the new Star Wars story, including one of its most memorable characters, Yoda and Count Dooku. And you have to have confidence, obviously, in your own work and bring that authority into it. But at the same time, to kind of have reverence for the fans in the way that Peter Jackson was, right? That he was going on all these message boards and forums and interviewing its fans for a number of years before even beginning to script his films. Again, it's such a humbling, and I think it does nothing else than to just add infinite credit to you in the face of all the fans and say, oh my God, look, this author knows exactly what our franchise is, what we've invested years into reading, and is doing its honor by knowing all the moving pieces.
Well,
Go ahead.
I have a follow-on thought about that, but I can wait if you've got a different question.
Sure, absolutely. Before I wanted to ask one question before jumping in the story of Yoda. I very briefly skimmed through the book, not every single detail, but another thing that Ken Flint of the Heart of the Jedi mentioned was that he said, Ben, another thing is we were left in our own devices because communication was tough. You either had like one monthly phone call or maybe one email, but you weren't always invited to it. You weren't sitting at the round table with George Lucas present, telling you how it should flow. So I wanted to speak about just a tiny bit on the logistics of it. Did you feel that you were connected, that Del Rey was always encouraging you and giving you ideas, giving you pointers where if you had like a writer's block or anything like that? Talk about the communication in general.
Yeah. On those timelines, you're not allowed to have writer's block. So that's not a thing.
That's not a thing. Okay. That's out of the question.
There's the writer, there's a sports writer named Joe Posnanski, who said, my dad works in a meat packing factory and he never got to have factory block. So
that's awesome. I love that.
So, I mean, I will just echo what your other friend said. It was pretty hands off. I didn't feel they weren't supportive. I just, we all kind of knew I had a job to do fairly quickly. And they were certainly, when I had a question, someone got back to me pretty fast. But there wasn't a ton of oversight, and there certainly wasn't, a story room or anything like that. They just said, do you have a thought? And I said, I got this idea for Yoda and Count Dooku. It's basically the Sith that came in from the cold, based on, it's a John le Carré novel, The Spy Who Came in from the Cold. And I think there might be an interesting story to tell about basically who's going to turn who, if anyone, and maybe that can be the engine for this novel. And they liked that idea and sort of said, Godspeed.
That's nice. That's interesting. So you did mention that you were a young boy, right? You were 12 when you were introduced first to Star Wars. But based on that very first childhood memory, that impression, who were these mysterious Jedi and what was Yoda's role in that story? Now, in regards to the original films.
Well, obviously, Yoda doesn't get there until Empire in 79, 80, I guess. So I was 15 by then. The Jedi are very interesting. They're, if you were a young boy in the 1970s, so let me back up a sec. My fundamental work is The Lord of the Rings. I got a copy of The Hobbit when I was 7. My mom said, there's more. So I read The Lord of the Rings that summer and every year obsessively 20 times. I knew the days of the week of Elish. I was that kid. But all of what fantasy meant to me, and not to me alone, I think it was, among other things, part of the success of The Lord of the Rings, particularly, its rise, it rises against the fall of the church.
Mm.
So as more and more people left or stopped looking at Sunday school as a place to address the sort of giant existential questions. What is right action? What's the difference between good and evil? Why do bad things happen to good people? In parallel with people slowly losing faith that that question was going to be answered to their satisfaction at Sunday school or at temple, the literature of fantasy rose for a generation to sort of fill some of that gap.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a pretty decent argument made that every foundational piece of fantasy through the first 30 or 40 years of the genre was sourced in a religious vision. Tolkien's Catholicism, Ursula Le Guin with the Earthsea trilogy. Her dad was the head of the American Archaeological Society. She grew up with Native American myth and legend sort of bred in the bone, and it is expressed through the Earthsea books. Mists of Avalon took the neo-pagan sort of religious or spiritual stance and explored that in A Hero's Tale. And Star Wars fits very nicely, very neatly into that canon as sort of picking up the Taoist and both the magical and the martial parts of the Taoist tradition in China, but stripping the serial numbers off and repackaging it as something that a 12-year-old from Texas would see as, oh, I'm a sci-fi fantasy guy. I get it. I feel that. That's for me. So I didn't know that it was Taoism redux at the time. I didn't know that there were, Taoism would eventually become Chan Buddhism, which would eventually jump across to Japan and become Zen Buddhism. And there's lots of that stuff woven through Star Wars. But when I was 12, I didn't know any of that, but I could feel it, right? And Yoda, who sounds not at all like Buddha or Christ, but quite a bit like Zhuangzi or the other Taoist sages, he's very much from that tradition. I didn't know it, but you can feel it.
Intuitively, you sort of, those ideas still seep through your pores, because one of the things that I like to mention, which is an obvious fact, right, that Hollywood's film engine during 50s and 60s, starting off from earlier experiments with Ray Harryhausen's spectacular visual effects that were known. I'm coming from Russia, throughout Soviet Union. My parents' generation, my generation, grew with that larger-than-life cinematic vision that came from the West. And obviously, George Lucas taking inspiration from Harryhausen and being a student of Joseph Campbell's, monomyth teachings and being a study of human psychology, we sort of transplanted all of that need, that necessity to believe in either a higher power or what is your true calling, the clear and distinct representations of good versus evil. All of that was in Star Wars. And when I was growing up as a kid, once again, coming from that bias of a child that didn't know anything else, I didn't know what the novelization was. I only thought there were only 3 movies being made. And looking at those Jedi and the way that Yoda and Ben Kenobi speaks about them, they were these mythological wizards that are few and far in between. But when they're present on the scene, people pay heed to what they have to say through their wisdom. Not because they can whip out this cool-looking laser weapon, just chop you in half, but because they carry that authority that Alec Guinness perfectly portrays in episode 4. I mean, you see him, he is that old samurai. He is Gandalf. He is the person who shifts, mountains and stuff like that. That's what they meant to me. And that brings me to my next question. What, in your feeling, obviously when the prequels came out, they represented a new era within Star Wars. The Art Deco, that classical Golden Age visual style, the different place in terms of hierarchies and political machinations, and Palpatine being this snake, this devil who is rotting it right from within. What would you say was the biggest change to Yoda and also to the Jedi, aesthetically, but also in terms of concepts?
You know what? Can I ask you? Because my guess is you've thought about it more than I have.
A great deal.
Someone once made the observation that Star Trek, the original series, was a Western, and that the next generation is like, we have encountered something unexpected. Let us retreat to our corporate boardroom and whiteboard it. A very different vibe. But there's something about that in that second set of films, is that it becomes less archetypal and more political. And Yoda in the Academy felt to me, and I could be totally wrong about this, and I'm very interested to hear your opinion as someone who's thought more about it, but somehow, if you'll indulge me in a metaphor, they didn't manage to quite bring the swamp with Yoda to the temple. And I feel that's sort of a little true of the Jedi in general, that there's a quality of mystery that was less evident for me.
See, with me, I remember coming out of theaters. I remember this day like it was yesterday with my younger brother. I was 4 years in the country. My English was semi-decent at that time. I started reading books, checking out movies. And I came out of the theaters with The Phantom Menace completely deflated. I couldn't believe what I saw on screen. I couldn't believe it was Star Wars I grew up with. I couldn't believe it passed for magnificent, stellar filmmaking in general, that people thought of it in this time. And again, this is not to disparage the amazing visionary George Lucas and his work, but I think that we should openly talk about critiquing art in a meaningful manner that is, my thoughts don't have to overlap with yours, and I don't have to be right about things, but this is my take on it. And when I saw these Jedi, which later on, throughout the 2000s and 2010s, a lot of people were saying, well, this is how George Lucas intended it to be. That's what he wanted to show. He wanted to show the corruption within the system and the Jedi who are so arrogant and stuck, they can't see past their nose. And none of it was invalidated in terms of what I saw on screen, because it felt like the original lore established in the original films, which, by the way, I wasn't latching onto it. I didn't go seeing Phantom Menace, which I was extremely excited about, to see what I wanted to see. It breaks all the fun of it. I was there just to have a good time and show me something new and different that I will enjoy, period. That's my only criteria. And I came out of it looking at these pompous guys running around, and they're bureaucrats and they're military. Now, hold on a second. Are you supposed to about wisdom and peace? And everything that Yoda was saying is specifically in episode 1, like you mentioned, it wasn't just like postcards. It's like it wanted to sound like it had gravitas and deeper meaning and intention, but it was just falling flat on the ground. And my argument to this day is, in defense of the prequel trilogy, is the jewel of a story that George intended to tell, but its execution didn't just align with it. Because you conceptually, even when as you grow older, I did my film school and I studied writing and all this stuff. You look at it and you understand what the intent was, but then you have to separate it from it. Well, hold on a second. How does the artist master his medium to convey his story? That's also important. That's equally important on the scale as the story itself. And just for me, it didn't work as much. That was my thought on the Jedi. And Yoda, when you see him leapfrogging like a Pokemon dude, jumping off the walls, doing all the CGI crazy stunts, for me, in order to suspend my disbelief and have total fun with episode 2 and later on episode 3, I had to make a mental note that this is not Yoda I remember. It's a different character. He looks like Yoda. He's there on the screen, and he's taking that particular role of a Jedi warrior. Because what did Yoda tell me when I was a kid in Russia with that stupid, cheap voiceover dubbing that we had? Luke says, "I'm looking for a great warrior." And Yoda says, war does not make one great. And then you take that, the pillar of that trilogy, and you completely... And I have experts who quote me from the book and show me excerpts from what George Lucas says throughout the interviews, throughout the years. Ben, this is how it was intended to be. But my inner gut feeling tells me otherwise. Like, no, I can't accept that. When I read your book, if I may jump ahead just a little bit, I'm sorry. When I jumped into your book, suddenly I'm thrown into that happy pond of childhood. I was like, it's him. That's the guy.
Well, good, because that was certainly the intent.
Yeah. Let's move on a little bit here. Portraying Yoda and Count Dooku together as a master and apprentice duet, I felt it was a very bold choice. Why? Because when we see actor, the amazing Christopher Lee on screen, he's much older. He's a seasoned, well-established older man who has seen the galaxy. He has seen the world. He knows how to Jedi operate. He knows what the Sith have to offer. And he's somewhere in between that he calls himself neither. Even though he has his Lord Tyrannus, title, he's not a true Sith in a sense. He is this disillusioned Jedi, or at least the way I'd like to see him. And it was very hard for me to imagine him as a young person until very recently, which the animated show starts showing us a younger Dooku. And yet in your book, when the two meet in a particular climatic scene at the end, there's a sense of reverence. You instantly see, you deduce as a reader who is the master, who is the apprentice, and that silent, in between the antagonism, there is that silent reverence for the master. Walk me through this. Like, how did you come up with this? I thought it was the most brilliant part of the book. Not all the action, which was great on its own behalf, but that particular part, which completely went to my heart.
Yeah. Well, that was the pitch, if you know what I mean. That scene, that was the starting point for the book. Well, that, and there were two things that were starting points for the book. One was that scene and that dynamic. And the other was something I thought when I first saw Star Wars in 1977 was, I really want to see someday a story that starts, the Force is weak in this one.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's always easy to write about winners. But I was interested in writing about the least talented Padawan at the Academy and what that was. So that idea and the closing scene between Dooku and Yoda were the two poles that the book spins around. And then from them, so I'm gonna walk back just a second.
Sure.
And I apologize for a slightly non-linear answer to your question, but I thought it would be fun to write the book. I thought, oh, this will be a fun thing. I'll write it quickly and it will be entertaining for me, and maybe it will entertain some other people, and I should get to work. And then about a week in, I began to get very, very nervous because became more and more oppressed by this thought that a lot of people were going to read this book. And a non-zero number of those people, to go back to a previous part of this conversation, were not people who were going to church every week, were not people who were going to temple every week, but for whom Star Wars was important in their lives. And when the day came that their girlfriend broke up with them, or God forbid, their mom got a diagnosis, the book with Yoda in it was going to be the book they were going to look to for an answer for that.
Mm.
So the responsibility for writing a book that should be hopefully very entertaining, yada, 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 but also needed at some important level to function as wisdom literature for people who are going to come to it in their dark moments, felt like a very serious responsibility to me. So, walking back a little bit, that meant that the book was going to have to answer. I gave that little spiel earlier about how all great fantasy novels are sourced in a religious vision, spiritual vision. So somehow this book was going to have to take whatever the spiritual vision of Star Wars could be characterized, and going to have to answer some very specific questions about why do we choose right over wrong? What do we do when we run out of hope? What is the universe guaranteed to work out? And the initial, to go back to the Taoists, I paraphrase, but the Taoists were the first people on record as a sort of large movement to say, have you ever noticed when things are really terrible and you pray, it doesn't help? So we should deal with that. And so out of that, and this sort of Taoist position of how do you orient yourself? How do you balance yourself in a world where there is no guarantee that even if there is a God or an omniscient force, it is not necessarily going to take care of you. It does not answer mail. Then you get to the moment in that book where I believe it's Hui says, well, what if we just are living in a world without the promise of good? What if it's all full of, if the nihilistic version is true? What if there is just the abyss? And Yoda says, yep, it's possible.
Yeah.
So when you take all that stuff away, all that's left to us is our choice. And I think the line he says is, be a candle or be the darkness, but choose.
Yeah. You will forgive me, Mr. Sean, if I don't recollect the exact dialogues. A lot of these novels I read as they were coming out, and only once, because there's so much to read in Star Wars.
Of course.
But a lot of friends that I do podcasts with, they sort of remind and they bring my memories back. But I also lean heavily on those few key moments that stay with me throughout the years. And what stayed with me particularly about this book, which I think is the heart and soul of Star Wars, is that intellectual and spiritual battle between the two, Yoda and Kenobi, before swords cross. That's brilliant. That's, again, not to make lightsaber duels seem shallow, but it's just the icing on the cake. If you don't have these missing components that speak to your soul, speak to your heart, everything else becomes quickly forgettable. And
so
yeah, go ahead.
The crux of the novel at that point, to give you the phrase that may or may not be in your head, Dooku tries to turn Yoda, and Yoda, where Dooku's there and they're sort of fencing back and forth, and then Yoda sort of shockingly cuts to the chase and says, turn me. Take your best shot. And Dooku says, basically, I can give you power. So I have lots of power. I can give you money. I can I don't need money. Um, uh, the force I believe in, is controls all living things. I don't need this stuff. Um, and the there's a moment at which Dooku says, "Well, what is it that you do want?" And he has a moment where whether it's something in the air or the thing is balanced more closely than he himself was anticipating. There's a moment where he has a vision of what would happen if Yoda did fall. And he suddenly realizes that was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing to ask for. And something that I think one of the nice moments there is that Dooku is genuinely taken aback at the idea that that could happen. Like
I
it's been
remember
incredible.
that.
It's
Yeah.
like it's like your dad, like you're really mad at your dad, but then if your dad does something that is genuinely shameful, it's like, oh my God, don't do that. Like it's okay for me to do that, but you don't. And uh so he sees this moment in which and tries to imagine what it would be like if Yoda truly did turn to the dark side, and he asks Yoda what he wants, and Yoda says, "Give me my rose.
Yeah.
Give me a thing that grows in nature, because death I've killed, money I've had, power I have. Until you can prove that you can make a flower, you've got nothing for me." Um, but he says it in a really mean way.
Yeah. I remember there's a scene in the film Attack of the Clones, which I enjoy rewatching all of them and reminisce. And there's bits and pieces there which are stroke of genius. I love watching them. Before they begin their formal duel in the film, Yoda sort of blocks Dooku's lightning, and he says, "Still much to learn you have, my apprentice." And it sort of shows that I love the fact that George's prequels stayed on track in terms of not trying to justify the evil or make it pseudo sophisticated and give reasons why. No, Count Dooku is a villain. And I think what made him compelling is that he knows that. And in your novel, you expand upon the idea that he sees the rot within himself, but he can't help it, because we end the book on a very cynical and a dark moment where he's more alone and abandoned than ever before. And that's what he is. And that's the creature that he has to wrestle with until the very end, until Anakin does the chop. But the next question I have for you is sort of small. It's technical. Before we move on, if you don't mind, I always muse on how authors portray established characters where you have famous, legendary actors attached to them, like Billy D. Williams and the Lando Calrissian. Do you have to look at, for example, Christopher Lee's mannerism and study him in the film, or you took your own kind of gut feeling of what this character is supposed to be and went with it?
I guess with the arrogance of the creator, um, I felt like I had a sense of who I wanted him to be inside, but I was very happy that he looked like Christopher Lee on the outside.
I mean, the appearance, the visage is fantastic. The costume, the beard, the seasoned Jedi warrior. He was very convincing for sure.
Yeah. So I didn't know much about the character of Dooku before they talked to me. So I basically had the same pictures and bits of script to work with. And obviously I knew Christopher Lee, who'd been who I knew some of before and had been at this point had also been Sarumaning. So we all knew a lot about him. And do you remember this story about Christopher Lee from the making of The Lord of the Rings? When
I may have. I mean, I watched those movies to death and behind the scenes as well. I may remember.
so it's relevant to Count Dooku a little bit.
Mhm.
So at one point they were doing this scene where Saruman and Wormtongue are sort of at the end, and Wormtongue stabs Saruman. And Peter Jackson's like, I wonder if we could sell it like a Scream or something like that. And Christopher Lee says, have you actually ever killed someone by stabbing them in the back? And Peter Jackson said, no. And Christopher Lee says, well, I have. And that's not the sound they make. There was a big moment for Peter Jackson because Christopher Lee was in the Department of Ungentlemanly Warfare, about which there's a movie coming out like this month. The original Dirty Tricks squad during the war. So he was just, I mean, that dude was a special forces operative, movie star at the age of 80 something,
Rock
released a
star as well, yeah.
album about Emperor Barbarossa. Like, what?
Yeah. I mean, a jack of all trades. He was just a tremendous, tremendous actor. But it's interesting because some authors, I think it's fair to say that some authors convey the likenesses of the heroes that you remember just better. There's something about their either prose style or being a fan of the films. They're able to be more convincing with their writing. So in this respect, I felt in line with my enjoyment of 80s Star Wars, in line with the Star Wars prequel. You sort of let it simmer and satisfy both worlds. You know, it felt that very Art Deco 60s deconstructed prequel era with its Yoda, who is this warrior who goes to meet his former apprentice, but also this, like I mentioned before, the duel of the minds from the Star Wars that I remember as a kid. There's another question I wanted to ask before we get to the end of the book. I don't know if you check on the recent Star Wars authors, but Claudia Gray has become quite a celebrity among especially old school fans like me. I mean, she knows it from all the way to Sunday, man. The way she writes Star Wars, like, yep, that's this, that. It's instantly familiar. And she has this book called The Master Apprentice, where what she does very interestingly, it's primarily about Qui-Gon Jinn and young Obi-Wan Kenobi, but she also makes narrative parallels to Yoda and Dooku and other characters to show you how different generations dealt with master and student apprentice. Was there something in your book? Because we do have two accompanying Jedi Masters and also their two apprentices, right? And then we get the two masters get rid of because when Asajj Ventress, she attacks them, boom, they're goners. But Yoda's still able to carry their spirit and their torch in instructing the younger crowd. Was it your intention to say, if I'm going to have this relationship, the basis of my story, I need to compare it to something else?
100%. So that's, I mean, among other things, many other things, but that's Shakespeare 101, right? Is you have a central dyad and then you do themes and variations all around, right? So if the central focus of this is between Yoda and Dooku, master and apprentice, well, then we're going to double it off and show both of our Padawans with both of their masters. But then Dooku and Asajj are a mirror of Dooku, and in which Dooku is to Asajj as Yoda is to Dooku, and we watch this sort of variations of that. And even the droids, the two droids are two different examples of what a master-servant relationship is. One of them is endlessly loyal and faithful, and the other is you're always on your own. So almost every character in that book is an echo of that master-apprentice dyad, trying to harmonize all those ideas.
That's interesting. I didn't think of the droids, honestly. They were somewhere vaguely in my memory, but for some reason I didn't compare them. To me, obviously, the most colorful ones were the Jedi that are in the book. It was quite traumatic to see them go, and how the younger ones have to go on, because those Jedi Masters are in a way also father or mother figures, whatever you want. But when they're gone, these younger people have to now deal with that reality.
So one of the things that was striking to me, and this maybe it's too much information, I don't know, but my dad left our family when I was very young. So I grew up with a single parent. And one of the things that I honestly had not known until I was talking to Del Rey about doing this book was this story that the Jedi were taken as children. And so there's a line in the book that says, every Jedi is a child whose family decided they could live without them. It is literally built into the Jedi Order that these are all children who at one level or another were abandoned by their parents. And that is a curious thing. And the master and apprentice role isn't just like a parent role, it's all they've got for a parent role. And that puts a lot of torque on it. So is when Dooku is meeting Yoda, Yoda is the only person who has never betrayed him, up to and including his own family. And I think Dooku at some level carries, I don't want to over psychoanalyze this, but children who are abandoned or sometimes abused take into themselves the message, you are unlovable. And that becomes the ground they stand on and the air they breathe. And I think that is a fundamental distinction to Dooku, that it's one thing for him to fall, because of course he would. He's broken. The world has told him that, or he wouldn't have been abandoned. But for Yoda to fall is inconceivable. So this sense that the other funny thing is that I handed in the book very close to physically on a Friday, and on the following Monday, I started working on a project for Halo 2, another alternate reality game called Isle of Bees. Feel free to look it up. And discovered that Spartans have the exact same story as Jedi. They too are taken from their families as children. And I was like, why is the universe always guarded by people whose parents are truly shitty parents? But I mean, as a person whose dad wasn't around, like, maybe that means I should just get my lightsaber in order.
You know,
Perhaps
I'll be honest with you. When I was watching the prequels in theaters, and I saw each one of them in theaters, and they got progressively more interesting for me personally. One idea that didn't sit well with me, and I'll be frank with you guys, I was very resentful for a very long time. I could not understand how you can have Jedi who are celibate and who are taken from their families at a young age. Because when we look, again, I'm returning to the original films because obviously have moved me in a much more significant way than prequels or the new trilogy ever could. It's a story of a family. It's a story of attachments. It's a story how hyperfixating on it and these relationships turning sour and being toxic leads to tragedy and death, and how it takes a whole new generation to bring the father back into the light. It's all about attachments. And now you're trying to convince me that for 20,000 years, these Jedi were noble by taking these orphaning kids from their families, and that's where they're supposed to. Of course, Anakin is going to grow up dysfunctional under them, with that chosen prophecy being burdened with, put on top of his shoulders, being a slave boy coming from, like, where are we going with this? What is this stuff? And I became a lot less resentful and shelled in my own ideas about Star Wars. And my heart became open and said, Ben, it's not going to go the way that you want. It's not universe to play with. This is George. This is a set of authors doing this extraordinary work. Take it or leave it. If you don't like it, go read, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom series, which I'm a huge fan of. That's the best course. It helps nobody sitting and crying about it all day.
Right.
But the point I want to make here is that I became a huge fan and paid a lot of gratitude towards the prequels because of the all expanded universe books centered around it. Because when I read your book and other book like yours, like the MedStar duology, part 1 and 2, the Cloak of Deception, the Cestus Deception, Rogue Planet, all these prequel era novels, you very intelligently and very eloquently expanded George's ideas that are meaningful to me. Again, putting all of that stuff, because I'm going to get to this very end with Count Dooku, we end in a very dark place. And what you're taking is, and all respect to you, you're taking a story that is not yours, these characters that don't belong to you. That's how, again, take it or leave it. That's how George designed prequels to work. And what you're doing is you're not going against that. You have the humility and insight to say, I'm going to add this additional part, which will give you a new perspective on Count Dooku. And I loved it because of that.
I will say that I did fight with them over one thing, unexpectedly. And I was surprised by this myself. I dislike it when authors move their characters around to prove a point in a way that feels like, I don't think that character would do that. I feel like you need to respect the character. Like the work of any piece of art, which is the creator saying, I'm much smarter than these dudes. See? I don't know. It's not a spiritually healthy position to come from. But I came across a very weird version of it as I started writing the book, and I was, I don't know, a few weeks in maybe. And I wrote to people at, I can't remember if it was Del Rey or Lucas directly. And I said, this is very weird, but I just can't write this book knowing that both of my two Padawans are just going to be dead in 6 months. I need you to tell me, you can even lie, but I need you to tell me that one of them will survive Order 66, because otherwise I feel like I'm just pushing them through an exercise to get slaughtered at the end. And they actually sent that up to whomever and said, okay, one of them can canonically survive. And it was very strange to me. Normally, I understand I'm called into someone else's world to do a job, but I just felt like I was running a con isn't quite right, but like I was letting them pretend that there was a world of possibility when in fact everything was forewritten. So yes, one of the Padawans does survive 6 months further, and for some odd reason, it was important to me that it be so, because otherwise it felt like it wasn't a real world in which things could happen. It was just filling out a spreadsheet.
And fans want, at the end of the day, and it never gets old for a reason, a happy ending. With years, I remember going from the Soviet era of filmmaking, which is clearly known around the world for its larger than life films, and to American cinema, and I said, oh, look, it's edgier. Look at the shots composed and the tricks used and the CGI effects and everything. It's better. I was looking on the surface of things. And again, some of my all-time favorite movies come from Hollywood. Ben-Hur, it's the classics of world filmmaking. But the point I'm making is, you look at one thing and it's just a picture, it's just visual, and then you get to other story that gets to the heart and soul of it. And at the end of it, a universal message of goodness and kindness and happiness needs to prevail at the end. It's what all the greatest films are all about. And I felt like with years looking at cinema, the more sophisticated and grounded and plot twisty the films are, the more phony they look. I don't want to see that. I know what gray and dark life looks like. I want to go and see the Star Wars movie and be about escapism. not modern culture, not modern, social strife or social divide that we have today. I want escapism. I want adventure. I want goodness at the end, which leads me to the end of our book here, because you do. And on a happy note, we have the cavalry arrive. Obviously, Obi-Wan Kenobi and young Anakin. They come to save the day, but not without a bit of darkness at the end, because Dooku is in a very dark place, and he feels more alone and abandoned and forsaken than ever before, because all the people he loved, his only family, the Jedi Order, he feels has betrayed him. He's replaced with these younger schmucks running around. I was your student, and you have forsaken me. So why should I pay tribute to the Jedi? Why should I go back to the good side? Obviously, he reverts back into his inner resentful child that is unwilling to cope with what he himself has become. And I wanted to ask what kind of conclusion you wanted the readers to draw from. Where did you want your novel to end? Knowing that eventually, obviously, we got to have an ending to the story, because Yoda tells Luke at the end of the Return of the Jedi, when gone am I, the last of the Jedi will you be?
I think the all of the a book ends for all of the characters, and in some senses, since many of the conflicts are mirror versions of one another, and many of the relationships are mirror versions of one another, the endings are also sort of harmonized with one another. So, for example, Dooku at the end, we see him in, you're exactly right about the moment where Anakin shows up, and it's right when Dooku is thinking maybe he could after all turn, and then he feels that he's been supplanted. And it's, I think, fairly clear that it's this initial wound. It's the wound of the abandoned child. It's the, you promised you would be my father, and now you're somebody else's father. He retreats into that hurt, and we know that that's where the dark side, that's where it gets you. It's in your hurt and your grief and your desire for safety, as Anakin and Padme's story eventually show, that the desire to be safe from death leads you to do many, many terrible things. And so the counterpoint to that, or one of the counterpoints to that, and I don't worry if you do not remember this, but one of the two Padawans, the one who will eventually indeed be killed by Anakin 6 months later, which I knew, and now reading it, you will too, but people didn't when the book first came out. Although, you had an idea that it was going to go poorly. But all through the book, he has been obsessing about a series of events that have suggested to him that he will fall, that he will turn to the dark side, because he's had a vision of himself. And while he doesn't understand that it's him fighting, or he sort of gets that it's him fighting Anakin or someone like that, and his assumption is, of course, that he will have turned, because otherwise, how could that be happening? It never occurs to him that Anakin might be the one who turns. But when he realizes that he is not, at the same moment that we know that he will die in the temple in 6 months, we also know the thing that he feared more than death was the death of the soul, that he would betray the people around him and what he believed in. So in a weird way, that moment for him, understanding that he is not the person who betrayed everything, is an enormous gift to him and is exactly opposite Anakin's story.
Mm.
So Hui is a foil for Anakin in the same way that Dooku is a different version of, Dooku is Darth Vader, as it were. Um, he is Anakin's future
Yeah.
after the fall, but Hui is the one who could have taken the other path. Um, and so each of the characters in the book, in some senses, resolves that question of who do I serve and why, a little bit differently. Um, and some manage to overcome their pain and some don't, and that's life. To go back quickly to the point you were making about happy endings, even even without pure escapism, one of the things that I always muse on, and I have outed myself as a Tolkien guy, but I I was always bemused. I think George Martin is a great writer. I think there are a lot of things that he does technically incredibly well. I was bemused by the discourse that said, here's fantasy, but it's real and it's gritty and it understands the nature of evil in the world. Tolkien was at the Somme. 800,000 men died in barbed wire trenches in the mud over 8 months. George, bless him, does not know more about evil than Tolkien did. But the question, when you're confronted with the problem of evil, the fact that there is evil is not news. It's what you do when you understand profoundly the reasons for despair that matters. And sometimes it's necessary to have a Yoda or a Gandalf or a whoever, because they're not there to deliver the news that there is evil in the world. You knew that. They're there to help you somehow make it to tomorrow, even in the face of that evil.
They offer you a hand. And speaking of the hands, which again, you're sort of reading my mind. I'm looking at my screen, like, oh my God, how do I ask a question that is sort of halfway is already answered? Um, all Star Wars fans are guilty of this. We find meaning and symbology in everything that pops on the screen. You can have a CGI frog leap through the screen. There's symbolism in there. A lot of fans have theories about Count Dooku's on-screen death when evil Palpatine obviously pushes Anakin over the brink and says, kill him. And he stares in Count Dooku's eyes. A lot of fans are saying this is Dooku's epiphany, and he's trying to come clean and make his confession to whoever will listen, and he's unable to speak because, Palpatine is choking him out, and then Anakin finishes the deal, and it's done. But at that particular point, when you saw the film, perhaps, or do you like to believe that there is a point in Dooku's life when he returns to light and then he's off?
Yeah, I think it's possible for me. I don't want to make it as straightforward as a deathbed repentance, but if you, and by the way, it's been a long ass time since I've seen that movie, so don't hold me to this, but we've talked a lot about mirroring moments. The moment at the end of my book is he's just about to turn to the light, and then he sees Anakin as a rival who has displaced him, and he turns to the dark. The moment in the film you mention, I think in my very private headcanon, which has nothing to do with what's real or what George wanted or anything else, but in my private universe, he's watching Anakin made his mistake. And it's like,
Ah,
and to the extent that he's pushed to the light at that moment, it's because he sees very clearly himself. And it's one of those moments that happen, like, you and I are neither of us 22 anymore. And there are those moments where you look and the difference between, I look at someone who's 25 and it's like, I've already made the mistake you're just about to make, and I can't stop you. So for me, I think in that moment for Dooku, watching Anakin dramatize the thing that has, because one of the things that I'm reasonably happy with is that Dooku is a villain, but he also knows he's in an ever narrowing path, that things are closing in on him from every side, and the sum of the choices he's made, there are no good endings left. And when he sees Anakin take the step that he took, in a sense, it makes for a repentance and even a moment of compassion. Plus, I mean, he's dying. He's going to get killed and all that. But I think he sees in Anakin, yep, I've been you.
It's that moment of Zen where we first act upon things in our life, and only then, much later, right, the realization of the repercussions of our actions come to us, and we're confronted by them. Mr. Sean, before I ask my last question, thank you so much for joining me. I was infinitely honored to speak with you, speak about this book, and touch back, reconnect with what made Star Wars special for me, and that's the expanded universe. And speaking of, it's 10 years, I think, exactly today, when the Star Wars was officially decanonized, decommissioned, rebranded into Star Wars Legends.
Really?
And Yoda Dark Rendezvous, your book, it came, I think, at a very, very special moment where we had, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, a decade of creative forces, a renaissance of Star Wars telling. We had video games, we had comic books, we had TV shows with the Star Wars Clone Wars short, micro series, Clone Wars, and then the Clone Wars, the CGI show as well. And a new generation of Star Wars creatives are now today building upon the world that George Lucas has created. And all of the authors, all you guys, thank you so much, contributed to that huge, huge sandbox that we enjoyed for so many years. How would you say the modern treatments of the Star Wars, like the creatives, are treating it thus far? Which project stood out to you? I know I've asked this before, but if there's one thing that crystallizes to you what Star Wars truly is, which project would it be?
Oh, what it truly is. That's a hard question. Because my favorite of the recent ones, as I mentioned before, are probably Andor and Rogue One, but neither of them are funny enough to be the perfect reincarnation. As is my wont, I might answer this question sideways. The science fiction critic John Clute, right around the millennium, started saying science fiction is dead. And partially that was just, a fun way to start a talk. But John's underlying thesis was that science fiction, fantasy, and horror arose as responses to the anxieties of the Industrial Revolution. And that as we were entering a phase of the world with the rise of the computer and the internet, there would be a new literature that would arise to address those anxieties. And the old metaphors, from Frankenstein on, basically the science fiction, fantasy, and horror are loosely, it's going to be great. It's going to be terrible. It doesn't matter. The evil is within us. And those three answers have sort of been genre fiction for 200 years. It will be interesting to see. One of the things about this age of the world, for example, is that we live much more collectively. There's a lot of what I would think of as flocking behaviors. You're part of it. You're a YouTuber. You are a voice in a community, and you have both an individual position, but you're also a member of a larger group. You're interviewing me, but doing it as a private citizen in your home. This is actually very new. Like, for me to get interviewed by someone, it should be someone in 1989 or 1995. It would be someone in a studio, maybe at a local news station, something like that. This thing is very much a product of life after Facebook, life after Twitter, life after all the kind of aggregating platforms which allow this kind of behavior in which we're both public and private at the same time, and both an individual and a community at the same time. And I think the very first genre piece to touch that exact chord at a mass level is probably The Hunger Games, because it was, we're having an adventure, but we're also on a reality show on TV. And for the first generation living through Facebook for the first moment, that sense of balancing who I am, but who I am in the TV show that is my life versus the not TV show of my life, difficult. If I were to have a very complicated answer to your question, I would say Star Wars we will recognize when Star Wars has truly, genuinely evolved when we see the thing that a person like you and I, who grew up with phone books, couldn't make. A version of Star Wars that only someone who grew up with mobile phones and TikTok could make. Not to say that it's Star Wars is a TikTok, but that way of understanding society, that way of understanding community, that set of things to be afraid of, that sort of set of things to hope for. When someone makes that version of Star Wars, we'll know if Star Wars can continue into this age of the world, or if it's just going to slowly coast like classic rock music on the era that it was born, but never jumped to the next one.
That is a very, very wholesome answer. Do you mind if I add to it my own little happy and humble 2 cents? It's just tremendous. Listening to you, I could do this for hours, to be honest with you. I always felt like we as Soviet kids, turns out, as I analyze today, especially in the social media dominated world, had a very, very open scope education. It wasn't about turning you in a very efficient worker who belongs in this placement, job placement, this career, and that's who you are. I mean, history, geography, from art courses, music courses around the world, French Revolution, American Revolution, independence, everything was encompassed. And along with it came the folklore and myth of Great Chinese, the classical period. And as a huge fan of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which I think are perhaps the greatest works of human achievement, and comes as a spoken word turned to literature, I think for us as fans, for me personally, greatness is when we can revisit the pillars of storytelling which are timeless. The archetypes that will live within us, like Joseph Campbell said, that we will replace. If religion is gone, we will replace it with something else, which is happening today. Celebrity worship, entertainment worship, it translates and converts to something else. And I think great Star Wars recaptures something that George Lucas, whether very deliberately or subconsciously, tapped into. He became a vessel through which a torrent of timeless motifs and story flew. And I think he was wise and conscious enough to say, let it rip. Let's go there. And that's why he always harkens back to stories that influenced him And younger generation filmmakers tried as they might, they also reference George Lucas because they recognize there's something larger than all of them flowing and continuing forward without break. And to me, if I make a small recommendation, one show that completely encapsulates the adventure, the fun, the humor, the lightheartedness is the Star Wars Rebels animated show. It's only 4 seasons long. It's intended as a family gathering kind of adventure. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It doesn't rely on nostalgia as a crutch. But you know, but Han Solo, we got to bring the bad guys. No, it's a clean slate that understands how to position all these core components, as I mentioned earlier, in a way that is instantly recognizable as Star Wars.
Well, that's great. Well, I'll take that recommendation very seriously. I haven't seen it, and I'd like to.
I love it. Mr. Sean, last question. What is your message to the new generation of Star Wars fans who are just now discovering the expanded universe, and hopefully through this podcast will discover Yoda Dark Rendezvous?
I mean, may the Force be with you.
That's a good
one.
one.
Some senses it will carry each of us on our journey. And how you understand my book or which of the other books to read, that's not my call to make. But if you come to this world with an open heart, it's a big enough world that you'll find what you need. It might not be in the first place you look, but sooner or later you'll find what you need.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor, sir. It was completely amazing to speak with you. And guys, I would add to that all of it is Star Wars. Old, new, the goodness emerges, and the stuff that is forgettable, it's going to be left in the dust. The great stories speak for themselves. I would say don't divide us into lines. Don't turn it into this is canon, that is canon. Like Mr. Sean said, have an open mind, an open heart to come into it and read it. And I think the expanded universe offers as much rich storytelling as a lot of modern Star Wars authors are doing. Once again, guys, thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I will put all the relevant links where you can check out Mr. Sean's books, his work, and so forth. If you enjoyed this, please support us.
My little friend.
Leave all your comments in the video section below. Leave a like. We'll check you guys later. Take care, everyone.